there's a thing called noise, useless change, in contrast to signal, which is carrying information. See, on the right side here, whether it's order or signal, that's information. Disorder or noise is randomness or entropy. Cacophony, sounds that make no sense at all, in contrast to organized sounds, which we call music. There's chaos, in contrast to cosmos. And the Greek word cosmos is used of the world, for example, but means to bring order out of chaos. It's the root, of course, to the word cosmetics, but I won't go there. We'll move on here. So on the left side, you got disorder, noise, cacophony, chaos. That's forms of randomness. On the right side, you got order, signals, music, cosmos itself, design. So the disorder, the collective term for that is entropy, randomness, confusion. And in contrast to that, you have information, things that carry intelligence. And the direction is always in the direction of entropy. Things are always winding down. It's as if the entire universe is like a clock that's been wound up that's winding down. We always go from order to disorder. You have to put energy in to go the other way. The natural trend is towards entropy. And when you take information and add confusion to it, or you put some noise into it, it degrades in the direction of entropy. If we do an entropy profile of the universe, I'm going to have entropy going upside down. Maximum entropy is the bottom of this chart, and order is at the top, if you will. And so entropy is going downhill, order is going uphill, okay? And so we have erev, which is obscurity and disorder, which later comes to mean evening, and boker, which means orderly, it's discernible, that's morning. And it's my suspicion that erev and boker define discrete steps in defining creation. We have the view that there was an event that caused a disruption between the spiritual and physical world. I'll come to that shortly. But it's interesting, when you get to day 7, the Hebrew translation of that passage, in the Onkelos translation, is that God imposed a unified order on the universe on day 7. And it's of course in day 1 that the main creation in day 1 is let light be. Okay? Well, that's day 1. Let's go to day 2, or second day more precisely. And God said, let there be a firmament. That's a strange word. We'll come to that. In the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which are above the firmament. It was so. God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. The erev and boker were the second day. Now the word for firmament is rakia, and it's a strange word. In the Hebrew, rakia means an extended surface. It's an expanse, but it's a solid expanse. That's the emphasis of the word. In the Greek translation, steroma also means firmness, and it's from that the Latin got firmamentum, from which we get the word firmament, which means a three-dimensional solidity or firm expanse. And that sounds like a contradiction, because it's firm and yet it's term. We would say space, but it's not empty. So that's the second day, and we have, when it speaks of waters, by the way, I suspect that what it's dealing with is what's called in rhetoric a stenectiki. Often you put the general for the specific or the specific for the general. For example, you say, speaking of a very good house hospitality, she sets a fine table. You don't mean literally the table, you mean the whole cuisine. See, that's an example in rhetoric where you use the specific to mean the general. And, or, boy, so-and-so's got some neat wheels, meaning his car. So we use those synecdoches all the time. When it says waters, I think it's talking about fluids. And one of the things most of us think of matter as having 3 states, gas, liquid, or solid. There's a 4th state of matter. Plasma before liquids, plasma before gases, and then gases to liquids to solids, or going the other way, from solid to liquid to gas to plasma, where you've got disassociated atoms. And I believe that's what's in view here. Is this more than a metaphor? All through the scripture, it speaks of the heavens being stretched. God stretches out the heavens, stretching out the heaven like a tent curtain. You can't stretch out empty space. That doesn't make sense. He stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He stretched out the heavens. The Lord who stretches out the heavens in Zechariah. And we could go on with dozens of verses that are consistent in presenting this rather fluid role there. And we now discover, by the way, that empty space is really an oxymoron. Space is not an empty vacuum. It can be torn, according to Isaiah 64. It can be worn out like a garment. Space can be worn out like a garment in Psalm 102. It can be shaken. How do you shake empty space? Hebrews 12, Haggai 2, Isaiah 13. It can and will be burnt up, according to 2 Peter 3. In Revelation 6, it says it's split apart like a scroll. That's interesting. It can be rolled up like a mantle, according to Hebrews 1 and Isaiah 34, or a scroll. Now that rolled up is a clue here. In order for something to be rolled up, there must be a dimension in which it is thin. You can take a map and you can roll it up. That's because it's thin, and it also, a two-dimensional map needs a third dimension to be rolled up. So this is a hint of another dimension. Space can be bent. So there must be a direction that it can be bent toward. And so thus there are additional spatial dimensions. And so we just know this from the biblical text, but we also know it as we understand what the physicists tell us about our universe, is that we now know that we live in more than 3 dimensions. In fact, more than 4, counting time as one of those dimensions. In fact, the current conjectures that we live in at least 10 different dimensions. So Nachmanides in the 12th century, by studying Genesis chapter 1, concluded that the universe has 10 dimensions and only 4 are directly knowable. That was his comments in his commentary on Genesis. Well, it's interesting that we've spent millions of dollars on atomic accelerators to discover the same thing. Particle physicists in the 20th century have concluded, since about 1984, that we live in at least 10 dimensions. 4 directly measurable, 3 spatial dimensions, length, width, height, and time, and 6 other dimensions are curled, as they would say in vector calculus, curled in less than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, and therefore they're only inferable by indirect means. And I think it's funny that we spent all this money on atomic accelerators to learn what Nachmanides did by doing his homework in Genesis 1. But moving on, let's talk a little about the atom. Most of us had some exposure to the atom. We think of the simplest atom, which is hydrogen, has a nucleus and has an electron running around it in the conventional representation of that. But there's a nucleus and there's an electron or more, and they're obviously in balance, plus and minus wise. But then this is obviously not to scale, because the atom is about 10 to the minus 3 on a scale, and the nucleus of the atom is about 10 to the minus 13th away. So that means, by the way, that there is the difference, the amount of space there, linearly is about 10 to the minus 5. If you take that volumetrically, that means that for every part that is particle there, you have 10 to the 15th emptiness. 10 to the 15th is a big number. If we were going to build a model of the atom, and we're going to let the nucleus be the size of a pinhead, the electron would be a football field away, literally 100 meters away. So an atom is mostly empty space. There's only one part in 10 to the 15th that is, in some sense, solid. But because of the electrical effects, it creates the illusion of having physical properties. And so we have H2O, where oxygen captures 2 hydrogen atoms, or we have other atoms where the whole hydrocarbon world is one of chaining these atoms by the electrical interactions of the atoms themselves, by imbalances. And so, what seems to be suggested is in the first early days of Genesis is that we had plasmas. They hadn't even formed molecules yet. And we have the properties of space. By the way, something else I should go on to. Space has properties. It has an electrical property called permittivity. It has permeability.